Well, welcome to Father and Son, and welcome to you, Tom.
Morning, Dad.
Tuesday morning, here we are. Well, it's been a busy weekend. I had 50th anniversary of the opening of St Paul's East Kew. Your grandfather, my father, was instrumental in that. And the mother, we all went along to the service. The Archbishop of Melbourne, the Anglican Archbishop, was there. And Mum was given the job of cutting the cake at lunchtime. She's the only living one left of the four people that really built the church.
Have you played an important role in the church's development more recently, Dad?
No, I don't live in that electorate.
Is there any church you're playing an important role in right now?
Yes, I go to St Peter's Eastern Hill occasionally.
That's very good.
Well, Carlton lost to Collingwood at the weekend, which was a bit disappointing. They weren't that bad, and they beat Richmond quite easily.
Yeah, so these are the NAB Cup. I think what was interesting about the NAB Cup this year, leaving aside the results thus far, is the fact that the AFL is trying some odd new rules. Now, a good rule, I think, is playing these shorter games, 2 20-minute halves. It appeals to people's inability to concentrate for very long. Secondly, they've got this sort of soccer-style out-of-bounds rule, that is whoever touched the ball last. That's ridiculous.
That is ridiculous.
From what I've heard, they'll get rid of it now. They had to keep it for one round of the NAB Cup so that all teams play under the same rules, but I think it will be got rid of before the pre-season trophy is awarded.
Yeah, I think it might be too. The other interesting thing, I think it is a good idea having 3 teams playing and having a short version of the game. There were 40,000 people in the backyard, and it really did, you never get crowds like that for a NAB Cup opening round.
No, well, this is the thing. Now, admittedly, these were the 3 of the powerhouse clubs that have been in Melbourne. Richmond, which hasn't had a good run since the early 80s, but is still a very well-supported club. And, of course, Carlton and Collingwood, 2 of the most popular clubs in the AFL. And the thing is, and again, this is something where you've got to contrast Australian rules with either the rugby codes or soccer or anything else. The fact is, to get 40,000 people along to a pre-season match, admittedly involving 3 teams rather than 2, is a fantastic result.
Yeah, it was. They'll all be very happy with that. Well, it's D-Day today for Foster's. Have they announced already?
Yes, Foster's has come up with a first half profit. It was around $336 million. That was a bit weaker than expected. The consensus of forecast was sort of 350 to 355, so they missed it by around about just under 20 mil. The usual culprits to blame in wine. The strong Australian dollar is hurting them in the US. Yep. Understandable. Secondly, of course, here in Australia, we've had a very strange summer thus far. It's been wet. We've had cyclones. To the extent that it hasn't been raining or cyclonic, we've had cooler than normal weather. As a result, beer sales are down. But at the same time, the company has said it is going to push ahead with the demerger. It expects to have this process done by around May. And what that will do is undo Foster's wine acquisitions from the past decade, such as Southcorp and Beringer, and effectively create the old CUB with beer and a separate wine.
It won't be the old CUB. When I left in 1990, we were the 4th biggest brewer in the world. We bought Courage, we bought Carling O'Keefe. We made a bid for Scottish and Newcastle, which they knocked back, the Monopolies Commission. We were really going places with beer. Ted Kunkel decided he didn't like going to England, so they sold off all their beer interests. And then they went into wine. They bought Beringer over there when the Aussie dollar was 52 cents. They made a terrible mess of it. And then they bought Southcorp.
Another mess.
Yeah, well, how much do you reckon they've written down by now?
Look, I think if you took count of all the costs over the years, I reckon it's north of $3 billion. Now, when you consider their half-year profit, it's just over 300 mil. Double that for the full year, 600 mil. They effectively wiped out 5 years worth of profits on wine. And I'll tell you what the problem with wine is. I know a lot of people that own vineyards, they've typically made their money doing one thing, and then they say, you know what, I like drinking wine, therefore I think it would be a good idea to own a vineyard. Well, that's like saying, I like driving a car, therefore I'll buy a car factory. I mean, there's no more guaranteed way to make a small fortune. Start with a big one and get into wine. It's a terrible business.
It is, and the reason, in my day, we looked at it, and we kept concluding that in the beer business, there was a very high barrier to entry. You needed a couple of billion to build a decent-sized brewery.
Yes.
To build a winery, you and I could start off tomorrow if we wanted to and have the money, and you go into the supermarkets now where they sell alcohol. There are thousands and thousands of brands.
That's right. I mean, the average punter can't possibly decide. In fact, interestingly, you mentioned supermarkets and wine. In the UK, of course, the big supermarkets like Tesco and Sainsbury's have effectively house-branded their wine. A lot of what they buy, they just say, here's a moderately priced wine, it tastes okay, it only costs £4 a bottle or something, and that's what sells well to the British consumer. But of course, there's not much money involved in that for the producer of the wine.
No, none at all.
Anyway, Foster's will probably de-merge, and sadly, there's a very good chance one or both of the divisions could be taken over. If Foster's beer is taken over post or even before the demerger, that's the end of Australian-owned brewing. Of course, Lion Nathan is already owned by Kirin of Japan, and SAB Miller, possibly Asahi, although they appear to have ruled themselves out, could decide that they like to bid for Foster's, even in its current weakened state.
I was talking to an ex-Foster's employee who worked when I was there the other day. He said beer sales in 1998 in Australia have now halved. And that's because the beer sales are falling in Australia, but new brands have come in, but their number one brand, VB, is going through the floor.
Well, look, it's not entirely Foster's fault. The thing is, in the old days there were only a handful of brands, and people picked their brand, VB and Melbourne Bitter, Carlton Draft, up in Sydney, Tui's brands and so forth, and that's what they drank. Nowadays you can have parallel importation. Importers can bring in their own stores of all sorts of European beers and whatsoever, and so people are experimenting more. The drink driving laws mean that people drink less anyway. Alco pops have come in. They weren't a big feature of the drinking market several a decade ago.
I think it's difficult, I agree, but one of the significant things Foster's did was lower the alcoholic content of their main beer.
And they did that to avoid paying excise. They said, yes, we can either keep the alcohol but have to increase the price a bit, or we can drop the alcohol from 4.9 to 4.7 and keep the price the same. That's what they chose, and history shows that it was a dumb decision.
Very dumb decision. They should go back to 4.9. VB's down to 4.6.
Now let's go to politics, and amazingly the Prime Minister Julia Gillard over the weekend signed a deal with all the state premiers, both Liberal and Labor, 50-50 joint funding of healthcare costs. It was going to be 60-40 under Kevin Rudd, weighted towards the federal government. I was amazed that the premiers all suddenly toed the line of this, and I've got a theory why. I think at 50-50 funding, if something goes wrong, both sides can blame the other. The state governments can blame the federal government, the feds can blame the states, and we'll have no more accountability for health.
But the most important thing also is that the big change is that they're not pinching the state's GST, which is significant because they were going to take a third of the GST. And I heard the Minister for Health, she was saying, well, we've got to face reality, Western Australia wouldn't sign up, the Bailey government didn't like the deal, and you're going to have a change of government in New South Wales. I heard Ted Bailey on the radio after the conference on the television, and he said this is a much better deal for Victoria than the one that was signed when Brumby was in power.
Look, it probably is, but the fact is this: we're going to have two bureaucracies, federal and state, both overseeing effectively the same hospitals, the same healthcare, and I just worry that a lot of the funding is simply going to go to fund the now dual bureaucracy. So I'm not confident. Now, what about overseas, Dad? In Egypt, we've seen not a bloodless coup, because a lot of people did die, but the military have taken over. They said they'll honour all peace treaties, and they will also hold elections in as little as 6 months' time. Now, I must admit, if you look at Middle Eastern history, and in particular what happened in 1979 in Iran when the Shah was overthrown, and people had very high hopes back then, what they got was a Muslim theocracy which suppresses people's rights. Now, do you think the Egyptian military will give up power to the public?
I do. I think the interesting thing about the Egyptian military, it is compulsory to serve some time. So all of the people of all different classes have all done military service. So the military is much more independent and thoughtful of all different types of people in Egypt. And I think they want to keep their source of close contact with the United States. Egypt's very important in any peace negotiations in the Middle East. They're the only country that are Arab that actually recognise Israel.
Well,
so
that's
I think
true,
it's going to be very important they do change the constitution and have proper democratic elections. I hope and think they will.
I hope they do, but I'm cynical about it. Look at Pakistan, look at Fiji, look at Burma, look at Iran, all these places. Once the military gets power, they very rarely give it up.
Now we've got the Royal Commission in Queensland into the floods. It's starting to become fairly apparent that they had that dam, whatever it's called.
Wivenhoe.
Overfull. I see, because they're expecting another cyclone and maybe some more flooding, that they're letting a lot of water out of the dam now, which is probably a good thing. So it'll be now used for the purpose that was originally put together, which was to stop floods rain flooding Brisbane?
You've got it. It's going to be so.
Oh, well, I think we've covered enough today, Tom. We'll see you all next week.
You've got to keep an eye on it.